Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game. And these are my 6 tips for beating Token Druid. Token Druid has been everywhere on the ranked ladder lately in Journey to Ungrow. And it got even stronger than it was in the past thanks to Ungrow cards like Living Mana and Vicious Fledgling and just a lot of the new beasts like Ravasaur Runt that synergize in some of the beast synergy cards like Mark of Yashiraj. All of that combined means Token Druid is a tier 1 deck that can be very, very frustrating to play against when they get off to those crazy starts. Now, sometimes you're just going to lose Token Druid games if they do get off to one of those silly, absurd kind of starts that you just can never actually recover from. But I do think there are some tips that I see people playing against Token Druid when they make mistakes, when they play against me, when I play this deck, little things they miss. So I'd like to talk through some of those tips so that next time you play a Token Druid, you'll be better equipped to defeat them when you actually do get the opportunity to defeat them when they don't get one of those super fast starts. So all that said, let's go ahead and jump into these tips. Starting off with my first tip, this one to me feels like it's pretty obvious, but it's something a lot of people get wrong, and that's that when you're playing a Token Druid, you should do absolutely everything in your power to keep minions off of their side of the board when you can, because they're going to buff them. They have the Power of the Wild, they have the Mark of the Lotus. So when you leave a minion out there, it's going to be able to do more the following turn than it did now. So if you have any opportunity to make a trade, for instance, a lot of people wouldn't want to trade, let's say, a 3-2 minion into a 2-2 minion, because they say, oh, that's a bad trade. He's going to kill my 3-2, and I'm only going to kill a 2-2. So they might just send their 3-2 face and say, I'll just let him make that trade next turn, because clearly that's a value trade for him. But then suddenly what happens is they play Mark of Yashiraj, and they get to trade back into your 3-2 and keep a minion on the board, and then they play 2 other things, and then they Mark of the Lotus it, and you're insanely far behind when you could have just made the trade and killed their minion in the first place. So if you've got some mechanism to kill a minion, 99% of the time, you should go ahead and do that, even if it seems like a slightly suboptimal play, because if you don't make it, often you're just giving the Token Druid the opportunity to do something even more ridiculous in return, and that's going to make the game even harder to win. So take the trades, kill the stuff when you can, keep their board empty, and they won't be able to build off of their minions, which is what they really like to do. Now on to my second tip. This is that you really need to pay very close attention to the cards that a druid is holding in their hand. If you're not someone who watches your opponent's hand, if you want to be truly good at Hearthstone, you need to start doing that, or at least use a deck tracker, use something to give you that piece of information, because there are a couple really important cards in Token Druids that if they got them in their early hand, if they got them out of the mulligan, for instance, and they've been holding on to them throughout the course of the game, you have a pretty good idea what those cards can be. For instance, Living Mana is a great card that you can gauge because they have to wait to a certain point to play it. There's also things like Swipe, which you'll see in a Token Druid deck that they might be holding on to if you haven't given them a good opportunity to swipe just yet, or if they've been more focused on their board. But if you don't know, if you're not paying attention, if you're not watching their hand, if you don't know that card came off the top or it's been in their hand for the last 4 turns, then you're going to be missing that information, and you might lose some way to play around Swipe, or you might not save the Holy Nova to kill the Living Mana that they're about to play. So you lose a lot of informational advantage, particularly in this deck where they have a very split kind of hand where you can learn as the game progresses, because they have a couple really high cost cards and lots more low cost cards. So just start paying attention, learn when those key cards might be waiting on you, and you'll start to win more games. Moving on to my third tip, this one's that you need to make sure you have a way to deal with Living Mana, because a lot of times you'll just barely be scraping by in the first 3, 4, 5 turns of a game. You'll do everything you can to keep up with the opponent's side of the board, and then they'll play Living Mana, and you're just totally out of gas, and there's nothing you can do, and they get to leverage that Living Mana into some sort of ridiculous turn. But because you know Living Mana operates in a very specific way, in other words, the minions always come down with 2 health, sometimes you can make plays or line up your strategy turn by turn in a way that kind of shifts your resources to save an answer for Living Mana later. For instance, let's say you're playing a warrior. Let's say Taunt Warrior, right? And they have, by turn 4, they've got a 3-3, a 3-3, a 4-4, and a 3-3, right? playing a taunt against those minions isn't going to do a lot, but if you have a brawl in hand, you could go ahead and use the brawl now, kill most of the minions, and then if they play Living Mana to follow up and rebuild the board, you could play down, for instance, an Ally Armorsmith, a 2/7 taunt that you know is going to likely trade into at least 3, maybe 4 living manas in a given turn, especially if they only have 5 mana and they're unlikely to buff those minions, right? If you're playing something like a priest, the order you use Dragonfire Potion versus Holy Nova in, if your deck happened to run both of those, could be different. A mage with Flame Strike and Blizzard, how you handle that could vary. Maybe you use a Meteor against a couple 3/3s and save a Blizzard or a Flame Strike for the living manas that go wide. A lot of different scenarios and examples you can imagine here, but essentially what I'm saying is there are small little subtle things that you can do in any given game to shift your resources around and shift your answers and removal in certain ways that favor one kind of board versus another. And since you always know what that living mana turn is going to look like, you can move your resources around in a favorable way to make sure that you save some sort of answer. Now, granted, there are going to be those instances where you just have to play everything to stay alive, and if they play living mana, you're just going to be dead no matter what. And that happens to everybody. You can't fault that. That's one of those games. Maybe you just couldn't find a line to a victory. That's Hearthstone. It happens from time to time. But essentially, if you use this tip in combination actually with the first 2 tips on this list, you'll find yourself seeing lines and seeing opportunities to deal with their threats in different ways and more efficient ways as well, as long as you have the foresight and the decision making to consider all of that and make it work in a very positive way for you. Moving on to my 4th tip, it's a really quick and simple one, and that's that you can't forget to account for Savage Roar. Yes, it's a common card in the list. You shouldn't be forgetting to account for it, but I see it happen pretty often where people do some math, they play some taunts, they line things up in a way that they think they're safe against certain buffs or certain minions that get played, but then they forget about Savage Roar. In particular, I think people often forget that the hero gets to attack with Savage Roar. People are so focused on the minions on board and the minion buffs that they kind of forget that 2 or maybe 3 damage that the druid gets to do itself when they play a Savage Roar, which can really change the math if you're trying to play defensively or trying to count out how much opportunity they might have for lethal and build your plays around that. So just remember it's a card. Remember and learn how to calculate the math on it, along, of course, with Mark of the Lotus and Power of the Wild and all the other buffs too. But most importantly, don't forget the druid gets to attack as well, so that might change your calculations a little bit. And also, double Savage Roar can happen, so don't forget that that's a thing either. Not that you can often play around it or that your strategy would change necessarily, but if you think you might be dead to certain outcomes, maybe it's time to play the taunt, maybe it's time to play the heal, it's time to Alexstrasza or Ice Block up, just in case, because these cards do exist. Moving on to my 5th tip, and this is really one I think that applies to most aggro decks and aggro matchups, depending on what you're playing, and that's that you often just need to really mulligan for the answers that you're gonna need to win the game. In other words, you shouldn't just accept cards that seem like they're gonna be okay against a certain deck. Maybe you see an Archanologist in hand and you say, okay, that's a 2-drop, it's going to trade in to Token Druid, let's do that. But alternatively, if your deck has Volcanic Potion and you don't see Volcanic Potion in your hand, perhaps you should just go ahead and hard mulligan that Archanologist, hoping to find the Volcanic Potion or whatever other answers you might have. Now, of course, that's true. Archanologist would trade pretty favorably into a couple Token Druid minions, but is it enough to win the game, or is it just going to keep you from losing the game a little bit longer? Might it just make you survive 1 or 2 more turns? And is that one extra chance to draw the really home run style card worth more than just a slightly increased chance of not dying? I think it is, because you have to play for the cards that win you the matchup, not the cards that don't lose you the matchup. And of course, every different deck, every different archetype is going to have different answers. I can't provide all of those for you now, but you need to think critically about what cards you need to win, what's going to find you the victory, and then mulligan specifically for those cards. Don't take anything less than perfection when you expect you're playing a super hyper-aggressive deck like Token Druid. My 6th tip, that's that you should sometimes make preemptive trades or sort of setup area of effect damage to counter incoming druid buffs. This is kind of difficult to explain, but let's just say, for instance, you have a paladin deck with 2 consecrations in hand, and your opponent has a bunch of minions with 3 health out there, and you have 4 mana, and you can consecration the board, and normally that seems like it would suck because you're not killing anything, and they have all 3 health minions, but what you're doing is you're putting those minions down to 1 health, and you know you have a second consecration in hand, and the next turn he's going to play Mark of the Lotus probably, or Power of the Wild probably, and those minions are going to go up to 4 health originally, or 2 health, now that you've already dinged them with your consecration, which means you can play the second consecration the following turn and now clear their board. But if you hadn't made that preemptive AoE, you'd never have a chance to do that. And that doesn't just apply with AoE, sometimes that can be minion damage, like sometimes sacrificing a minion just to soften the health total for a future play can actually go a really long way against these kinds of decks, because you can have big swing turns where you wipe their board and you stabilize. You don't have to go blow for blow with these decks necessarily. One Flame Strike can win you the game, right, as long as you chip the health down enough. One Blizzard can win you the game as long as you chip the health down far enough. So don't be scared to make what I would consider sort of really brave, sometimes very risky, often inefficient plays that just mean you're going to have a better chance to win the game in the following turns, right? So the consecration example is probably the best one I can come up with, but every deck, every matchup is going to have instances where you can think 1 to 2 to maybe even 3 turns ahead and put yourself in a much better position to win the game. As long as you're willing to sacrifice a little bit now, it'll often pay off a turn or 2 down the road, as long as you have some insights into what your opponent might be thinking about or what they might be planning to do next. And there you have it. That's my list. Those are my 6 tips for how to beat Token Druid. Sometimes you won't do it, but if you start to employ these in your play regularly, I think you'll find yourself winning some extra games, which is always a nice feeling. And really, it only takes 3, 4, 5 extra games climbing the ladder to make the difference between a rank you thought you could achieve and the rank you can actually achieve. So don't scoff at big plays that just win you 1 game. As long as they happen consistently enough, you're going to keep getting better. You're going to keep climbing at Hearthstone. So all of that said, I'm sure you guys have some tips of your own. I'm sure you've found a lot of helpful things when playing Token Druid. So please share those in the comments below. I would love to read them because I want to keep getting better at Hearthstone too. And I'm sure a lot of the people watching the video would love to hear a second opinion and your take as well. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.